And so by 1966 and 67, Lyndon Johnson began feeling like he was slipping deeper and deeper into this quagmire, a swamp that he just couldn't get out of. The early, quick, and relatively easy victory that Johnson had hoped to achieve was not coming. The longer the war dragged on, the greater the opposition on the home front became. And again, this is in keeping with the quote I read at the very beginning of this lecture. We'll talk more about the anti-war movement on the home front in just a little bit. But one of the problems as well was that Lyndon Johnson found that he was beginning to lose the trust and faith of the American people. On May 23, 1965, David Wise of the New York Herald Tribune coined the phrase credibility gap because there increasingly came to be a distance between truth and reality and what Lyndon Johnson was telling us. He lied about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He lied about how much he knew about what was going on. He lied about troop escalation and the numbers of forces. He lied about how the war was going. And so the American people were beginning to turn away from Lyndon Johnson the longer and longer this war went on. The bombing campaigns as well had another negative psychological effect in the United States, as many of the pilots who were shot down found themselves as prisoners of war. And you see a picture there on the top right of some of these prisoners of war. That's actually as the war is coming to an end. Conditions for these prisoners of war were abysmal beyond belief. They were tortured. If they had any wounds, their wounds would be kind of exploited. Rather than trying to help them and heal them, the enemy would make their injuries worse or use them in the midst of torture to try to extract information. Many of the POWs were forced to record statements disavowing the war or their loyalties to the United States, and those messages would be played back on the home front to their families, which was an agonizing experience. So the more of these kinds of things that went on, the more and more American support for the war began to drift away. As a final kind of surreal aspect of this war, I want to mention the process of body counts. Without the ability to kind of look on a map and determine where the enemy was and what territory we were taking, it was decided that the method for determining success in this war would be the counting of bodies. And we arrived more or less at an equation of 10 to 1, that if we could kill 10 of the enemy for every one of ours, that we were achieving success. Well, this process of relying on body counts was so fraught with errors and questions and challenges that it has become one of the more notorious aspects of the entire war itself. First and foremost, and it should be said before we even start discussing the process, who's to say that killing 10 of the enemy for every one of ours means success? It was just a completely arbitrary thought that is really not rooted in anything. There's no evidence to it. There isn't anything grounding it. So the whole idea of body counts is sort of meaningless. And yet it became such a guiding element of the war that we can't discuss the Vietnam War without mentioning the idea of body counts. So let's talk about some of the problems associated with this. Well, for one thing, if you are relying on counting the dead bodies of the enemy as a measure of your success, one of the things that encouraged was for officers to undertake especially risky missions, seeking out large numbers of the enemy, because that's where you're going to kill more of them and be able to count a greater number of bodies. And so there are many instances of forces being led into combat under less than ideal conditions because the prospect was there of tallying up a big body count. This also produced something of a scoreboard mentality. Many of the bases literally had scoreboards somewhere where they would notch, the body counts that had been achieved for different platoons or different units out there in the field. Competition was very intense, and there becomes sort of a jocularity about the whole process. Again, this is all part of the idea of just kind of losing sight of what's actually going on here. Now it's almost like a football game or a sporting event where we're just counting bodies and notching them up on the scoreboard. There is the process of counting bodies itself, which becomes very problematic and at times was very dangerous. The enemy, much as the United States troops, is determined not to leave bodies behind, both for kind of humanitarian purposes. You want to give a proper burial and bring them home to their families, but also just to deny the enemy the knowledge of what's going on. So how really do you count bodies? You look at the scene in the bottom picture there where there's just sort of devastation. How do you go into a situation like that and count bodies where there may only be remnants of bodies or blood splatter as opposed to any certainty that there's an actual body there? This also led to many American soldiers and officers beginning to ignore the rules of combat. And there are rules of combat, and in fact every soldier in Vietnam was given a little card that had rules about the proper ways to fight, and they involve things like the proper treatment of civilians and so on. Well, if you are measuring success by counting dead bodies, why not just kill people and count the bodies and then have that be chalked up as success? The unwritten rule came to be, if it's dead and Vietnamese, it's VC. You see what's happening there. People would go into these villages where who knows if they're actually VC, Viet Cong or not, shoot first and then count up the dead bodies after. The custom came to be, if anyone was running away from a helicopter or anything else, then they must be the enemy. Well, who's not going to run away from a helicopter, a heavily armed helicopter coming toward their village? So whether they were enemies or friends, a lot of civilians were killed. And so on the whole, I think there comes to be a desensitization to the humanity of the people involved. We're desensitized to what is happening and to the fact that these people, the South Vietnamese, we're trying to help them. The jokes that derived out of this were in incredibly poor taste, but also give you a little sense that we're losing our sense of humanity as far as the civilians. Vietnam, man, bomb them and feed them, bomb them and feed them. Bomb the schools and churches, bomb the rice fields too. Show the children in the courtyards what napalm can do. When we kill a pregnant woman, we count it as 2 VC, 1 soldier and 1 dead cadet. And there are many, many of these kinds of horribly tasteless jokes, but they all gives you a sense that the killing of civilians came to be almost accepted practice. And finally, there was the reality of falsified reports. Again, if we're trying to count bodies as a measure of success, if we're using this as a means of promotion of officers and rank and all this sort of thing, why not lie a little bit? We all know that the count out there in the field, we're not counting all the dead bodies, the enemy's taking so we'll add a few. And so it gets to the point where, out in the field, they're adding a few, the officers back in the base add a few, and it gets to a point where we really have no idea how many of the enemy we've actually killed or not. And this cartoon gives you a sense of the the lack of reliability on body counts and what a sort of random process it became. Sir, we have met Charlie and he is ours. Got a body count, Captain? Private, what day is it? February 15th, sir. 15 enemy dead, sir. In other words, he's just making up the number based on the date. And that is essentially the idea, that the numbers would just be pulled out of thin air.